Gavin Ashton set the earrings in Farah Lennox's open palm without looking at his wife when he did it. 11 years of marriage, 11 years of Joanna, building a life beside this man, through the lean years, and the doubt years, and the years when he called her at midnight from a job site in Beaumont because the financing was falling apart, and he didn't know who else to call. All of it. Every compromise, every quiet sacrifice, every morning she poured his coffee before she poured her own, dismissed in the span of maybe 40 seconds, in their own backyard, while the September heat pressed down on the Houston afternoon like something heavy and indifferent. The earrings were pearl drops. Her grandmother Vivienne had given them to her on the morning of the wedding. "Wear these today," Vivienne had said, "and whenever you need to remember who you are." Gavin had them in his jacket pocket. He'd planned this. "These," he said, holding them out to Farah, "belong with someone going places. If you're watching right now, welcome to Crimson Secrets. Before we go any further, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss a single moment of this story, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see just how far this one travels." Now let me tell you about Joanna Delaney. She was standing 3 feet away when he said it. She had been deadheading the roses along the back fence when she heard the gate open. 2 sets of footsteps, not one, and she turned around with soil, still on her garden gloves, and found her husband walking toward her with a woman she'd seen exactly once before, at a company dinner 8 months ago, a woman who wore confidence like a second dress and had looked at Joanna that evening with the particular kind of studied boredom that exists to communicate something. Joanna had filed it away. She was good at filing things away. "Farah," Gavin said, "this is Joanna. Joe, we need to talk." Not my wife, not even her full name as a complete thought. Just, "This is Joanna," the way you might say this is the guest room. Joanna pulled off one garden glove, then the other. She set them on top of the fence post and looked at her husband. This man who had called her the smartest person he knew for the first 4 years of their marriage and had spent the last 3 treating her quietness like a character flaw. And she waited. "I should have done this better," Gavin said. "I know that." He didn't look sorry. He looked like a man who had rehearsed looking sorry and had chosen, at the last moment, not to perform it. "But I think we both know this hasn't been working." "Do we?" Joanna said. Not a question, an observation. "Joe, you could have talked to me, Gavin." "I'm talking to you now." She looked at him steadily. 11 years pressed against the back of her throat. The years she drove to Beaumont on weekends because he needed her there. The years she turned down the fellowship in Florence because the timing wasn't right for the business. The years she told herself that love was a long game and not a short one. She looked at him and she felt something she hadn't expected. Clarity. Cold and clean as a window after rain. "The earrings," she said, because she saw where his hand was going. "They were a gift to you. I'm just..." He stopped. He tried again, the way men do, when they've decided something is happening and just need the sentence that makes it acceptable. "They suit Farah better. You never wore them anywhere that mattered." He held them out. Farah took them without quite looking at Joanna. The very careful, studied neutral of a woman, trying not to enjoy something she is, in fact, enjoying. Joanna looked at the empty space in his palm where the earrings had been. "All right," she said. She walked back toward the house. She didn't slam the door. She didn't turn around. She walked through the kitchen, past the dinner she'd already started, past the copper pots his mother given them, up the stairs and into the bedroom, and she sat on the edge of the bed, and she allowed herself exactly 2 minutes. The tears came because she was human. They came because 11 years is not nothing, and love, even when it has curdled into something unrecognizable, still leaves a mark on the way out. They came because she had genuinely, without reservation, without calculation, loved this man. 2 minutes, she counted. Then she opened the closet. She pulled out the overnight bag she'd had since graduate school. She packed without rushing. Clothes for a week, her grandmother's photograph, the leather-bound notebook she kept beside the bed. She walked back downstairs past the sound of Gavin's voice, drifting in from the yard. lower now, the way men's voices go when they're performing ease for someone new. She found the burner on low under the soup. She turned it off. She wrote on the back of an envelope, "The soup is done. Don't let the pot sit." She meant the soup, she thought, stepping onto the front porch into the pressing Houston heat, that she might mean other things too. The cab took her to a hotel downtown. She checked in, sat on the edge of the bed in the air conditioning, and let the room be very quiet. And in that quiet, something that had been sleeping inside Joanna Delaney for a very long time began, carefully and without hurry, to open its eyes. There is something Gavin Ashton did not know about the woman he had just walked away from in his own backyard. He did not know because Joanna had spent 11 years making absolutely certain he would not. Making certain that the version of herself she offered the world was precisely what people expected. A woman who drove a sensible car, who brought homemade food to departmental meetings, who wore museum-appropriate blazers, and spoke carefully, and never once entered a room expecting to be noticed. He did not know that the quiet, ordinary life Joanna had built was not a symptom of limited means. It was a promise. Made 9 years before she met Gavin, in a room that smelled like cedar and old leather, in the sitting room of her grandmother's estate outside Baton Rouge. Vivian Delaney had built one of the largest private commercial real estate holdings in the Gulf South, over 6 decades of patient, invisible work. She had started with cotton processing facilities, inherited from her own parents, turned them into industrial parks, and expanded quietly into mixed-use commercial developments. Across Louisiana and Texas, always through holding companies with deliberately boring names, always through lawyers compensated generously for their discretion, always below the radar of journalists and society editors, and anyone who might make the mistake of writing her name in a headline. Privacy, Vivian used to say, is power that doesn't need to announce itself. She had 1 grandchild, Joanna. Her parents had been killed in a highway accident when Joanna was 11. Vivian had raised her after that, with books and a serious, settled insistence that the people around you should want to know you before they know what you're worth. Before she died, 7 years before Joanna sat in that Houston hotel room, Vivian had asked for one thing. "I want you to live your life without the money visible," she said. Her hands were thin by then, the skin almost translucent, but her eyes were the same as they had always been, clear and considering and warm. "Not forever, just until you're certain. Wealth changes how people see you, Joe. It changes what they want from you and what they're willing to give. Find someone who loves you in the rain without knowing. Then you'll know it's real." Joanna had promised. She had kept that promise for 11 years. She took out her phone. She scrolled past a cluster of texts from her closest friend, Noelle, who had apparently been trying to warn her about something she'd seen at a restaurant 6 weeks ago, and hadn't known how to say, and she found a different contact, one she hadn't called in over a year. Rupert Chase had been Vivian's attorney for 35 years. He was 70 years old, silver-haired, impeccably careful with language, in the way of a man who understood that words had weight. He answered on the second ring. "Miss Delaney," he said, formal, measured, the way he always was. "Rupert," she said, "it's time." A pause. He knew exactly what she meant. They had discussed this contingency years ago. Not because Joanna had expected the marriage to fail, but because Vivian had insisted she prepare for everything. "Are you all right?" "No," she said honestly, "but I will be. Can you meet tomorrow?" 9 o'clock, he said. "I'll have everything ready." She was there at 8:55. Rupert had 4 folders on the conference table. He opened them in order, and Joanna learned, over the next 2 hours, the full current shape of the world her grandmother had quietly built around her. She had known the broad strokes. She had not known the number, the actual audited figure, updated to reflect 60 years of compound growth, in the hands of someone who had never panicked and never chased a trend. Hearing it made her set down her coffee cup and look at the window for a moment, before she looked back at him. "That's considerably more than I understood," she said. "Your grandmother," Rupert said, used to say the secret to building anything lasting was the same as the secret to character. Do the right thing consistently, quietly, for a very long time. Joanna felt the familiar ache of missing her. That sounds exactly like her. Then Rupert opened the second folder. There are elements of the portfolio, he said carefully, that bear directly on your current situation. He told her about Gulf Coast Partners LLC, a real estate investment vehicle, a sub-entity of Delaney Land Holdings, owned entirely by the trust, untraceable to Joanna. Without specific knowledge of the holding structure, Gulf Coast Partners had been the lead investor in two of Gavin's critical early development projects. A mixed-use complex in Clear Lake that had established his company's regional reputation, and a waterfront conversion in Galveston that had, in Rupert's measured phrase, provided the liquidity that kept the company operational through the 2019 market contraction. Joanna was very still. He didn't know, she said. He had no reason to. The investment agreements were signed by Gulf Coast representatives. Gavin had never had any contact with Delaney Land Holdings or the trust. She funded his company, Joanna said. My grandmother funded Gavin's company. Anonymously, legally, through structures invisible from the outside. Rupert paused. She left a note. He opened a sealed envelope. Inside was a single card in Vivian's handwriting. The same slanted, careful cursive Joanna had grown up reading on birthday cards and grocery lists and occasional notes left on the kitchen table. If the man Joanna loves needs a foundation to stand on, I will give him one. What he builds on it will tell us everything we need to know about him. Joanna pressed her lips together. She knew, she said quietly. She knew this might happen. She hoped it wouldn't, Rupert said, but she prepared for it. He opened the third folder. This one was about Farah Lennox. Farah was 31 years old. She had grown up in Shreveport in a household already shadowed, by the time she arrived in it, by the story of what had been taken. Her father, Whitson Lennox, had been Vivian's development partner on a commercial project in Baton Rouge in 1994, a warehouse district conversion that had seemed modest at the time, and had turned, 18 months after completion, into something considerably more when a national REIT acquired it at triple the original valuation. Vivian had bought Whitson out at market value 6 months before the acquisition. The buyout had been legal, the timing had been precise, and Whitson had spent the rest of his life believing, in the place where a man keeps his certainties, that he had been maneuvered. He died when Farah was 22. He left behind a mother who worked 2 jobs, a younger brother, and a family story that had calcified over decades into something close to doctrine. The Delaneys took what was ours. Farah had built a career, a genuinely impressive one. Joanna had to acknowledge that, reading through the file. Corporate strategy, sharp instincts, a reputation for knowing which deals were about to become valuable before anyone else saw it coming. And at some point in the last several years, she had begun applying those instincts to a different kind of project. She had found Gavin Ashton. She had placed herself in his orbit and she had begun steering him, carefully and patiently, toward a joint venture with a private equity firm called Stratford Capital, run by her older brother Colt Lennox. The Stratford deal would bring Lennox family money into Gavin's Gulf Coast portfolio. It would give them an ownership stake in properties that sat, in several cases, on land parcels connected to the Delaney legacy. It was not a crude plan, it was architectural, the work of someone who had grown up with a wound and had turned it into a blueprint. Joanna closed the third folder. Can I stop the deal, she said. The Gulf Coast Partners agreements include standard protective provisions, Rupert said. Any major structural change to Gavin's company requires notification and approval from the senior investment partner, which is Gulf Coast, which is the trust, which is you. He doesn't know that. He has no reason to. A pause. If he proceeds with Stratford without knowing, he triggers the notification clause automatically. His own attorneys would inform him that a senior partner holds approval rights. He would find out about the trust, about you, through a legal filing, without context, without the full picture. Joanna sat with that for a moment. I want to try it the other way first, she said. Rupert looked at her. Something in his expression shifted, carefully, the way careful men shift. I thought you might, he said. She called Noelle that afternoon. Noelle Gaines had been her closest friend in Houston for 8 years. An event planner with a gift for knowing everyone and being genuinely liked by all of them. A woman who had texted Joanna 4 times in the past month with messages that all circled the phrase, I saw something I think you need to know about, and never quite landed. Joe, Noelle said, picking up before the first ring had finished, tell me where you are. I've been losing my mind. I'm okay, Joanna said. I need your help with something. Anything. Farah Lennox, do you know her? A short pause. I know of her. She's been around the past few months, on the junior committee for the Contemporary Arts Museum benefit. Why? Is there an event coming up where I might run into her, without it looking like I sought her out? A longer pause. The museum's annual conservation benefit is Thursday night. She's a table sponsor. I'm on the planning committee. Perfect, Joanna said. Joe, Noelle's voice dropped. What are you doing? I'm figuring something out, something bigger than the marriage. That sounds ominous. It's the opposite, Joanna said. I just need to understand it better before I can explain it to anyone. A pause, and then quietly and fiercely, he's an idiot, Joanna, a complete irreversible idiot. Despite everything, Joanna almost smiled. I know. Thursday came cool and overcast, the kind of Houston October evening that felt borrowed from somewhere further north. The conservation benefit was held in the museum's grand atrium beneath the glass ceiling. 500 people in good clothes standing among artworks that had survived centuries and would survive them too, which Joanna always found either humbling or comforting depending on the night. She found her seat. She accepted a glass of sparkling water and looked across the room. Farah Lennox was already there. In this setting, she was even more composed than she'd been in Joanna's backyard. But the composure, now that Joanna was looking for it, was visible as a thing constructed. The calibration of it, the way her attention moved around the room, performing ease while actually measuring it. She was not an evil woman. Joanna understood that, watching her across the warm, lit room. She was a woman who had grown up carrying a story she hadn't written, had turned that story into a strategy, because strategy is what you do when helplessness is the only other option, and had found a target, and moved toward it with genuine intelligence and years of focused patience. Joanna understood that. She didn't approve of it, but she understood it completely. She waited until after dinner. She looked up and found Farah already looking at her. From across the room, directly, with an expression that lasted less than a second before the professional face came back down like a shutter closing. Something in that fraction of a second was real. Something that might have been, underneath everything, the ghost of guilt. Joanna set her napkin on the table. She stood up. She crossed the room. She stopped beside Farah's chair. Hello, Farah, she said. Her voice was quiet and completely even. I was hoping we'd get a chance to talk. Something tightened in Farah's jaw. Joanna, a half-beat. I didn't expect you to be here tonight. I know, Joanna said, but I am. When you have a moment, 5 minutes, just us. There's something I think you should hear. Farah looked at her. She was calculating, measuring, deciding what angle this was. 5 minutes, she said. There was a smaller room off the south corridor, used for donor meetings. Quiet enough. They sat across from each other beside a window that overlooked the museum's courtyard, a fountain going dark and steady below. Farah closed the door. In the privacy of the smaller room, something shifted in her face. Not softness, not quite, but the first hint of exhaustion, the kind that settles into a person who has been carrying something very heavy for a very long time. What do you want? She said. The same thing you do, Joanna said. The truth. A silence. I know about your father, Joanna said. I know about the Baton Rouge Project. I know what you believe my grandmother did to your family. Something moved through Farah's face all at once. Confirmation. And the grief underneath it. And then something harder to name, something that had been waiting a long time to be seen. Then you know, she said, why I did what I did. I know why you started, Joanna said. I'm not certain you know how to stop. Farah looked at her. Your grandmother maneuvered my father out of a windfall he had every right to share in, she said. Her voice stayed controlled, but the effort was visible. He trusted her. He trusted the partnership. And she used that trust, and she watched him spend the last 20 years of his life with nothing to show for what should have been his. I grew up in that house. I know what bitterness does to a family from the inside. A pause. So yes, I built a plan. I found the closest thing to a pressure point in the Delaney legacy, and I used it. I'm not going to apologize for wanting it to mean something. I'm not asking you to apologize, Joanna said. I'm asking you to know the full story before you decide what it means. She told it, without softening, without protecting her grandmother's memory from the parts that were hard. Viviane had known about the REIT acquisition before the buyout, not insider information, nothing illegal. But she had been better positioned than Whitson to read the signals, and she had used that advantage without telling him what she knew. The buyout was legal. It was also cold. It had cost Whitson Lennox something he could never recover, and Viviane had known that. And she had proceeded anyway because she was precise, and she was patient, and she had not, in 1994, fully reckoned with the distance between being right and being decent. Farah listened. Her hands tightened around the arms of the chair. She lived another 20 years, she said when Joanna finished. She never said a word. No, Joanna said, she didn't. How do you defend that? I'm not defending it, Joanna said. I loved my grandmother completely. What she did to your father was wrong. Not illegal, but wrong. And I want to fix it. Not because I'm afraid of the Stratford deal. Because it's the right thing. Farah looked at her steadily. She looked like someone who had been running for a very long time and had just, for the first time, been forced to stop and feel what that running had cost her. What does fixing it look like? She said. The voice was careful. Brittle in the way of people who are afraid to want something in case it's taken from them again. I don't know yet, Joanna said, but I think we should figure it out together. She opened her bag and took out a single folded document. She set it between them. My grandmother's attorney prepared this, she said. It's not a settlement. It's not a legal maneuver. It's a calculation. What your father's share of the Baton Rouge project would have been worth had the buyout occurred at the post-acquisition valuation, with 30 years of compound growth applied. She paused. It's significant. It doesn't undo what those 30 years actually were for your family. Nothing does. But it's real. It's an acknowledgement that something real happened. Farah looked at the document. She didn't pick it up immediately. Why? She said. Because my grandmother tried to, Joanna said. In her own late, insufficient way, she tried. I'd rather finish what she started than pretend it doesn't need finishing. Farah reached out and opened the document. She read the first page. Her face moved through things that had no easy names. The arithmetic of grief. The math of what a life might have looked like if one deal had gone differently. She closed it. I need time, she said. Take whatever you need, Joanna said. She stood. She looked at Farah one last time, this woman who had arrived in her life like a controlled demolition, and turned out to be something far more human than that. Someone whose grief was real, even if her methods were wrong. Someone who had been running toward justice and away from pain. For so long she'd forgotten. They were two different directions. For what it's worth, Joanna said, I think you deserved better than the story you inherited. The wound. Underneath all of this was real. I'm not asking you to let it go. I'm asking you to let it be something other than the whole of what you are. Farah said nothing, but her eyes were very bright. Joanna nodded once, not warmly, not coldly, but honestly, and walked back out into the light. She called Gavin the next morning. He answered on the third ring, his voice carefully neutral. The tone he used when he didn't know what someone wanted. I need to meet with you, she said, not about the settlement, about your company. A pause. My company is fine. I know you think it is, she said, "but there's something you need to understand about how it was built. Before you move forward with Stratford, you need to see this." The silence lasted long enough to tell her everything. He had been sensing something was wrong for weeks. He had been choosing not to look down. "Monday," he said finally, 2 o'clock. She was there at 1:55. She told him everything. She watched his face while she talked. About Vivienne, about the trust, about 60 years of invisible work, and the promise Joanna had made to keep it invisible. She watched him absorb it piece by piece. The way you watch someone disassemble a room they believed, they built entirely themselves and find under every surface someone else's careful labor. She told him about Gulf Coast Partners, about Clear Lake and Galveston. She watched the moment it landed, the internal collapse of his certainty, private and complete. The way a man looks when the story he has been telling about himself turns out to be missing, a chapter he never knew existed. "You held up the whole company," he said. His voice was almost inaudible. "My grandmother did," Joanna said. "She gave you the foundation. The work was yours, Gavin. The decisions, good and bad, were yours, but the ground under your first 3 years? That was mine." He looked at his hands. He looked at the table. He looked like a man who had run out of the story he was telling and is standing in the silence it leaves behind. Then she told him about Farah, about Whitson Lennox and Baton Rouge and the family doctrine of betrayal that had hardened over 30 years into something architectural, about the Stratford deal and what it was designed to accomplish. She told it without cruelty, without editorializing, without using the anger she could have justifiably carried into the room. She just told him the truth, all of it. When she finished, the room was completely still. She had a plan, he said, not accusatory, almost plaintive, the voice of a man checking something he desperately needs to still be true. "It started as one," Joanna said. "I'm not certain it stayed that way." He looked at her sharply, then away. He stood and walked to the window, and stood there, with his back to her, his hand going to the back of his neck, the gesture she had watched 1,000 times, the thing he did when he was overwhelmed and trying to contain it. "I called you ordinary," he said to the glass. "You did." "I gave away your grandmother's earrings." "You did." He was quiet for a long time. Then he turned around, and what she saw in his face was not what she'd expected, not defiance, not the scramble to reframe. Something had gone out of him. The particular armor that men build when they've been telling a story about their own greatness long enough to believe it's the whole truth. It had gone out of him, and what was underneath it was someone she recognized from a very long time ago. "I don't know how to fix what I did to you," he said, "but I want to understand what I'm actually looking at. All of it." She opened the folder. She walked him through everything. The Lennox connection, the Stratford deal, the legal mechanisms. She told him about Corbin and Wells, his 2 senior partners who had been trying for months to tell him something felt wrong with the Stratford approach. The men who had been with him from the beginning, who had built the company alongside him with their own hands. "Call them today," she said, "before anything else. They deserve to know the full picture. They earned that." He nodded. He was already thinking forward. She could see it, the part of him that was genuinely capable reorganizing itself around the new information. "The Stratford deal," he said. "Can't close," she said, "not because I'm blocking it out of spite, because it's built on a foundation that no one at the table fully understands, and deals built that way collapse and take everyone near them down." He nodded again. Then, very quietly, he said, "You always knew what mattered." "So did you," she said. "You just stopped listening to it." The divorce went through. The settlement was renegotiated, considerably, by 2 teams of attorneys over 3 careful weeks. When Joanna signed it in Rupert's office on a Thursday morning and walked out into the Houston sun, she stood on the sidewalk for a moment and felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Not happiness, not yet. Something lighter than that, like a window opened in a room that had been closed for years. Farah called 2 weeks later. She accepted the proposal. She also eventually came to understand the buyout the way Joanna had described it. Not the family doctrine, not the clean villain story, but the real one. A woman who was sharper than her partner and used that sharpness without mercy, unable to fully justify what she had done. The distinction mattered. It didn't erase 30 years, but it changed the shape of them, and in changing the shape of them, it changed the shape of Farah. Not overnight, not cleanly, slowly, the way real things change. 6 months later, Joanna announced the Delaney Arts Foundation publicly. Her name on it. For the first time, the Delaney name attached to something visible and out in the open after 60 years behind holding companies with forgettable names. The foundation's purpose was specific. Unrestricted grants and mentorship for working conservators, restoration specialists, and preservation artists who lacked access to institutional funding. People doing serious, careful, essential work on things that would outlast all of them, doing it without anyone to write them a check. The announcement ran in the Houston Chronicle and was picked up by 2 national arts publications and 1 business journalist, who wrote a piece with the headline, "Who is Joanna Delaney? The woman who's been saving art and funding Houston real estate without anyone knowing." Noelle called within 4 minutes. "The headline," she said. "I know," Joanna said. "Joe, it says." "I know what it says." "This whole time," Noelle said, and her voice dropped to something very quiet. "All this time, and you were—" "I was keeping a promise," Joanna said. "The promise is over now." She got the earrings back in the end. Rupert's office coordinated it, which was, Joanna thought, the most grace she had ever seen Gavin manage. They arrived in a small envelope with no note. The earrings themselves said everything that needed saying. She wore them to the foundation's first public event, Pearl Drops, her grandmother's choice, her grandmother's hands, her grandmother's voice still faintly audible, in the particular weight of them against her skin. She stood in a room full of people who now knew her name, and she thought about Vivienne Delaney, who had never stood in a room where people knew her name, who had built 60 years of something extraordinary in the deliberate dark and asked one thing in return: that the person she loved most go live a true life and find out what it was made of. Joanna thought about what hers had been made of. She thought about garden gloves, and a Houston hotel room, and a phone call placed in the quiet after midnight, and a woman sitting across from her, in a small room off a museum corridor, eyes very bright, holding a document that was not enough and was also the right place to start. She picked up her water glass. The woman Gavin Ashton had called ordinary, in his own backyard, was standing at the center of something he could not have imagined, not because the money had made it possible, though it had, and not because the power had made it hers, though it was, but because she had spent 11 years choosing, quietly and without audience, who she wanted to be, and when the moment arrived that asked her to be that person in public, she already knew exactly what it looked like. Her grandmother had built an empire in the silence. Joanna intended to build something better in the light.